So when, you can't really convince someone anything in this world because we have fundamental axioms, right? We have axioms for all our beliefs. So we have one singular belief, and all our beliefs stem from that. So generally, it's religion. It's very difficult to convince someone. But if you have an open mind, you can get there. But you have to deal with your preconceptions first before delving into the evidentiary arguments, which are very important. So I don't know how many of you know what these mean. Pantheism would be the universe is God. So the most well-known philosopher Spinoza, he said that the universe is God, but there's no free will. Because if the universe is God, then there's no free will, because everything is material, regardless. Then you have pantheism, which says that God is the universe, God also extends outside of the universe. Right? This is the general view by most rabbis. Can you have Joshua sit down, please? We've started recording. Yes. Alright. Yeah.
I can see the screen.
It's facing the right way.
Yeah, it's facing the right way. I can't see the screen though, so I hope it's working. It was.
I think it's working. The red.
The red thing's
I can see the red flashing.
Emona.
Yes. So, atheism, opposite of theism, no God. You know that for certain. Agnosticism, not really sure. We all know those. But pantheism, the idea that the universe is God, popularized by Spinoza. If the universe is material and God is purely material, then God isn't really the universe. It's kind of a way of saying it. It's not real. Then we have pantheism, which is similar but has a sharp distinction, which is God actually exists. And the universe is willed by God, willed into existence by God, which means it's essentially part of God. But there is an agent, a high consciousness determining what happens to us. That is what most rabbis here believe. Pantheism. Then you have deism. Deism is quite popular among many secular Jews, which is that there was a creator, there's a higher power, but I don't really believe in the Torah. I don't believe there's any divinity. I don't really believe in miracles. I don't believe in divine providence. That's deism. And then there's theism, which says that there is a God and interacts with the world, being through the Torah, through miracles in our daily lives, speaking to us, responding to our prayers. That would be theism. So what's important to understand is trying to convince someone, if they're a deist first, you can convince them. Because if they're a deist, they expect miracles. Because you see something happening and someone points out miracles are product of timing, right? So it can either be coincidence or miracle. A miracle can often be chopped up to a coincidence if we assume that there's no God to begin with. Now, so on Mars, we see this hole on Mars. What do we assume? We would assume it probably happened naturally, right? Because we assume our preconception is that there's no people on Mars, so why would there be a hole on Mars? So we assume not. Even though it's unlikely to have a pretty symmetrical hole like in that picture. But in our backyard, if we saw it in someone's backyard, we would assume it's man-made. Why? Because it's still a symmetrical hole, and generally symmetrical holes are made by human beings. And we know there are probably human beings present in the backyard. So again, your preconception matters. Preconceived views. Now, in order to change our preconceived views, we have to deal with the philosophical arguments. We have to come to either a deism or a pantheism. There's a higher being who potentially interacts with the world, but we're not really sure. So the first argument, the teleological argument, I'm going to present. Hopefully that'll get you to at least a rough deism. Telos, there's a S missing there, I spelled that wrong. Telos is the Greek word, essentially means purpose or object, aim. Now, it's the idea that if you look, it was generally used to regard biological life because it appears that our hands, our thumbs, opposing thumbs, we can pick up things, we can manage tools. So there's a purpose to those thumbs. Now, Darwinian theory largely discredited the teleological argument with regard to human beings or animals. But it can also be used to look at electrons, atoms, quarks, subatomic particles, various forces. These all work together. Okay, we wouldn't expect that. The default should be that there's no forces, there's no particles, there's nothing. Yet we see that. And then there's the other kind of sub-argument from the teleological argument, which is the fine-tuning argument, which is that all our particles in the universe appear to be fine-tuned for life. Being that gravity, if gravity was 1% more, the universe would collapse. If gravity was 1% less, the universe would fly apart. You've heard those. The ratios of the electromagnetic force, the strong force, the weak force, all the ratios of various forces are so finely tuned that we can't actually comprehend how finely tuned they are. Now, because of that, we can assume there might be a design. There are some scientific rebuttals to these theories, largely mathematical, these ideas that there are regressions of the constants of physics, right? That we have, say, the force of gravity. That we can take a mass and we can multiply it by specific numbers, and if some mathematics, we can find the actual gravitational force. Now, if that was changed slightly, yes, but there are some theories that said there's a regression of those constants, those numbers, which would explain the fine-tuning. So we just happen to ask, of course we're going to ask, it's going to seem to us that we're in a finely tuned universe because we're here to ask that question. That's kind of the anthropic principle. But those theories are largely mathematical and rely on heavy theoretical physics, which again goes back to the teleological argument in that how does that physics come about in the first place would be the question there. But there are non-trivial rebuttals to the teleological arguments. I don't think it's the strongest one, but I think it certainly gets us thinking about maybe there is a designer or a grand designer. So this is, I think, this is the least intuitive, but I think it's the strongest in that they have the weakest rebuttals. Being dualism of the hard problem of consciousness, the idea that there's a mind, and the mind is separate from our brains. Right? So generally, if you're an atheist or materialist, being that everything is material, you say, my brain. But that is, you can't say my brain because your brain is you. So you can't say that. But dualism said, no, the mind and the brain are distinct. And then we think, but it's separate from our brain. Although there is clearly some interaction between the brain and the mind. You take some paracetamol, it's going to relieve your headache. So there's some interaction there, we know that. But then there's a hard problem of consciousness, which is that scientists cannot explain how consciousness arises, the mind. No one knows. So this is Rene Descartes. You've probably heard, I think, therefore I am. The one thing we can know in the world is that we exist. That is perhaps the one thing we can know. We could be in a simulation, nothing could be real. The whole universe could have been created 1 second ago. Could have been created 1 second ago with all our memories, and all of our memories were placed 1 second ago into our brain by random atoms just forming together and creating this universe. We wouldn't know that. Could happen. But we exist, and that's what we know. So there are a few thought experiments which demonstrate that the universe is not only physical. Now, if we conclude that the universe is not only physical, that gets us at least to some agnosticism, because atheism generally says that the universe is completely physical. Now, this is the theoretical Mary's room. Now, you can imagine this woman Mary. She's in this room, and this room is hypothetically full black and white, in that she looks at her skin as black and white, like scales of grey, shades of grey. Now, Mary says, okay, I'm going to spend the next 15 years studying colour. The white light waves, the electromagnetic spectrum, the visible waves, it hits the eye, hits the rods and cones in the back of the eye, hits the brain, goes through these neural pathways. And she studies everything. She could write on a textbook, how does light work, how do we see colour? But one day she walks out of the room for the first time, she sees colour for the first time, and she's learned something new. She's learned something new in that we all perceive colour, which means that colour is not physical, because if colour is purely physical, we should be able to write it in a textbook. We can write the mechanism by which we can perceive colour, the light, the brain circuitry. But we can't explain colour. Like if someone was born blind, how do you explain colour to a blind person? Like how would you begin to say that? Someone's born blind, how do you explain the colour red? You can't. And same with smell. How do you if someone's never smelt anything, how do you explain the smell of barbecue? I mean, when we ask each other, how do you explain barbecue? We might use descriptors that are other smells. Barbecue smells like a mix of this smell and that smell. Strawberries and bananas sort of smell similar, at least more distinct from steak, for example. We could say that. But you're still using words that require us to understand what it's like to smell things. So the universe, we know from that the universe is not only physical. There's this great paper by Thomas Nagel in 1974. It's called What Is It Like to Be a Bat? Now, bats have echolocation, right? So they can kind of put out sound waves and it can hit them and they can kind of see the room, right? We can't really imagine what that would be like. We can't explain that because it's another sense. We can't understand what it would be like to have another sense. Like if someone was born blind, you can't really explain to them what it's like to see. Someone was born without ears, you can't explain to them what it's like to hear. You cannot use words to describe that. And then there's this idea by David Chalmers, probably the most prominent philosopher in philosophy mind. He's an Australian actually. He says philosophical zombies. It's this thought experiment. Can you conceive of a world where human beings can have conversations like we do, and they're not conscious? They're the machines. Like we can set up two AIs. We have two AIs talk to each other, and we assume that AIs are probably not conscious, right? Yeah, they can talk to each other like we do because they've been pre-programmed, but they're not conscious. So why should an outside observer assume that a human being having a conversation with another human being has consciousness? We only assume that because we have it, and we assume they're of the same species, therefore they're probably conscious. I can't know any of you are conscious. I know I'm conscious, and I assume that you guys, because you guys look like me, that you guys are conscious, but I can't know that for a fact. It's the same idea. Why should an external observer assume that two zombies having a conversation like we are now are conscious? You guys might know Sam Harris. In the 2010 the New Atheist movement came about, the big four horsemen, Sam Harris. So he's directly from his website. He's a neuroscientist, strong atheist, but he concedes. He says, arranging atoms in a certain way appears to bring consciousness into being. This fact is among the deepest mysteries given to us to contemplate. Nothing about a brain studied at any scale even suggests that it might harbour consciousness. It's a mystery. Even the most skeptical neuroscientific atheist will say we cannot explain consciousness. We shouldn't expect it, yet it exists, right? So that should bring us to at least an agnosticism or a deism, right? Again, the idea that there's a creator, a higher power, there's something beyond the physical. Perhaps it doesn't interact with the world, we don't know. So that's kind of what the brain looks like. The brain's just a collection of neurons. So just a bunch of little things. Kind of what they look like, right? So you can imagine a thought, right? If you close your eyes, most of us will see the colour red. If we can close our eyes, we see that. And what is that? Scientists say it's just a pattern of neurons, right? I don't know how, I assume there are trillions of neurons in the brain. This is obviously an oversimplification. You have 5 neurons here. But scientists say, well, where is the redness, right? If you cut the brain open, we don't see red. If they're imagining red in your brain, you don't see it. So is the redness at the start of the neural pathway? Is it the end of the neural pathway? Is it the whole thing? Doesn't really make sense. If it's the whole thing, then it lasts the duration of the neural pathway. Then you take out, say, 2 neurons. So 2 neurons create redness. The 2 neurons in itself, absent the entire pathway, that doesn't make any sense. Why should we assume that there's any colour? If we crack open the brain, we don't see redness if we crack open the brain. And some people say, oh, it's like a computer. But no, a computer has a projection. It projects something onto a screen. And that screen is physical. We open our brains, there's no physical screen. Only screening exists inside our mind. It's not a physical thing. So there's this other argument, it's called the argument from psychophysical harmony. And it's this phenomenon where you pinch yourself when you feel pain. You put a match under your hand, it feels hot. Why doesn't it feel cold, right? It's like we have a specific neural pathway that programs for pleasure, pain, specific types of pain. Why do we assume, how does it get it right? Some arbitrary combination of neurons creates pain as opposed to pleasure. It just happens to get it right. How does the brain know that? Why does some pattern of neuron create heat and some pattern of neurons create cold? We can't explain that. Scientists are lost. They can't explain anything. That should at least give us some reliability on the fact that perhaps the world is, beyond materialism. Yes.
Is it not possible that we have developed distinctions and we associate them with survival mechanisms, and thus we assign?
So what are the
them as
distinctions?
correct? Well,
Patterns of
this
neurons.
specific feeling of whatever.
I'm going to limit this to 2 back and forth.
Okay.
I'm going to be doing
This
up.
specific feeling or whatever
Yes.
causes this specific feeling or whatever. If I do too much of this specific feeling, I burn to death, therefore hot.
Yes.
Is that not possible?
No, but what's causing that hot feeling?
What do you mean?
A pattern of neurons, right?
Yeah, the pattern of neurons, of course.
So why does that pattern of neurons create heat as opposed to cold?
What do you mean? We associate it with if too much.
It's
then burn to
associated.
death.
But where does
So
that
we-
association? Where does that association come from?
We assign an arbitrary feeling to it. Like the word heat.
We
for me is-
assign?
Yeah, of course.
Well,
It's an arbitrary feeling.
Yes.
So you think the distinction between pain and pleasure is arbitrary?
Well, no. I mean, it's
Some
a,
people.
yes,
So assigned.
but I mean,
Okay, we'll talk about that. Yes.
Are you-
I don't want to do this.
Just to clarify, sorry, is your point like there's no reasonable explanation as to why we feel pain from heat, or is it that heat exists? Is it like
What? How does the brain know that a specific pattern of neurons creates pain as opposed to pleasure?
Sure.
Because pleasure looks the same. If we cut open the brain and we look at the brain reacting to something pleasure, like scratching your back feels good, right?
The same chemical
It
release.
looks
Yeah.
the same. It looks the same as pain. If we crack open the brain, that's what it looks like. So how does the brain? How do we know that? How does the mind interact? Yeah.
I mean, it's dopamine, no? Like, if you...
No.
Well,
there's a
it's
chemical release of dopamine in your brain when you feel something pleasurable.
Well, that
The same way that there'd be
so
a chemical
dopamine.
release of adrenaline if you burn yourself.
The
Yeah, but
dopamine.
neurochemicals are between
That's
neural
first,
synapses, right?
Yeah.
They affect neural
But he's saying, how do you know the
pathways.
difference?
But it's the same problem in a way.
Oh, you're saying...
Watch.
One chemical is oxytocin, one chemical is dopamine. They're a little bit different, but why does the makeup of the atoms create
So you're talking about the
feeling in a
cells.
way?
Yeah. gotcha.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. So, one of the problems proposed by the philosophy of mind very recently is called panpsychism. I think it's absurd. It's the idea that all matter is to some degree conscious, right? All atoms are to some degree conscious. Putting aside that there's no evidence for this theory, there's another problem, which is how does that create one unified consciousness? If all our, I don't know, probably many atoms in our brain, but we feel like there's a singular coherent consciousness in our brain. So how does any pattern, even if it seems ordered, even if the pattern may have evolved some certain way, why does that pattern create a unified? Even though you could say yes, evolution said that one brain was unified, one brain wasn't unified. So Darwinian theory says that the brain that was unified survived and the brain that wasn't unified died. That still doesn't explain that. How does it unify in the first place? Yeah.
My big question here would be, is it not reasonable to assume that every feeling and sense of ours would be its own form of consciousness, and the recollection of all of it together to keep us as a system, a human body alive, is what we call a unified consciousness. But we're not a unified consciousness. Like me sensing there's a certain amount of CO2 in my blood, is it not safe for me to assume that's a form of consciousness? It tells my body to breathe out, and thus I recognize it, and the recognition of all of these separate processes as a whole.
But
is
if
how
I
I
gave
am me.
you a lobotomy and I drilled into your brain, you still have functioning brain parts which provide consciousness.
So, I mean, you took out one piece of the consciousness, and so I
But
still
if
think I'm me.
That's what a lobotomy is, right? You drill into the frontal cortex, you have no consciousness. So if we drill in halfway or the full way, there's still multiple fundamental requirements for consciousness.
So what you're saying is, without the frontal cortex, we are not conscious at all.
Yes, according to science. Right?
Com-
You can have like homeostasis, and then your body can function unlike a ventilator where you're pumping blood through the body.
So
But
the,
there are lots of parts of the brain you can't. There's some parts of the brain, like you could cut open the corpus callosum, for example.
Right.
You can divide, right? And you can actually function pretty normally. That's how they fix epilepsy.
right.
But there's still parts of the brain which are fundamental. Right. So okay. So now hopefully I've kind of created at least some form of deism, agnosticism, right? Maybe even kind of a pantheism. I don't know. But the next one is Daniel 11. So you've heard Daniel. Daniel is technically not a prophet in that we define prophet as someone who's God spoken to directly. Daniel is in the writings of the Tanakh in that he had dreams, visions from God. Now, everyone says that Daniel chapter 11 is the most historically vast, predictive chapter, right? So it's extremely specific. Now, Daniel, during the Babylonian exile, was exiled to Babylon and he had these dreams, and you don't even know that much of the context. But I'll just read some of Daniel 11. Yeah.
Super quick. You dream prophecy. You said he's not a prophet?
Prophecy technically requires God speaking to you. So if you look at the prophet, for example, it says, the Lord said this. Daniel starts off in that I had a dream, and it's kind of mystical, right?
But I've definitely, not to like just to say, I've definitely heard of prophets that have had dreams where it was like a story being told to them with angels even like corresponding to them, and they would just basically say what might happen, so long as it's true.
They probably have lots of. Well, I'm just telling you the Tanakh doesn't put Daniel in the section of prophets, right? Yes.
Okay, so I need to ask a clarification question. Do dreams require consciousness?
Yes.
Okay, but why if you can't have consciousness, according to science, as you said, with a lobotomy, why can people with lobotomies dream?
Why can't people with lobotomy
They
dream?
can't. They
They
can't.
can't.
Yes, people with lobotomies can dream. They can have a dream.
No, how do we know that? Because people with lobotomies can't communicate their dreams, so even if they did, they wouldn't be able to tell us.
People with lobotomies can function.
Like
They literally live. They and
Depends how, I suppose it depends how far you go in the brain. For the most part, no.
So I'm a little bit confused on what consciousness actually is.
Consciousness would be the first person experience. So the technical term would be qualia, right? Actually
that.
experiencing something from the first person as opposed to the way like the table's experiencing something. Yes.
And that's entirely dependent on the portion of the brain that is removed through a lobotomy.
It depends how far you go in the lobotomy, I suppose.
That's
I'm not
a
an
good
expert
point.
in
I mean, if you
lobotomies.
kill a
I was
person-
just waiting. I don't know exact technical
Sorry.
time.
Sorry.
Yeah. So Daniel 11. So I'm just going to read, like, it's extremely specific. Now, a lot of the prophecies, the atheists would say, okay, you made a general guess in the right direction, and, you know, I heard this analogy the other day, I can't remember where I heard it. It's like, the atheists will say some prophecies, you shoot an arrow at a tree, and you draw the bullseye around the arrow. So it looks like the arrow's hit the bullseye, but it's not, right? But no, this isn't the case. It's extremely specific. Like, they will come to him as he does, example. It's like they will rise in his place a contemptible one upon whom they did confer the glory of his kingship. He will come in peace and will possess kingship through goodness. The arms that will sweep away will be swept away before him. It's extremely specific. Like all secular historians say that the book of Daniel must have been written after the fact that the historical events happened, because it's too specific. You can make generalizations. He will arouse his strength in his heart. The king of the south with a great army. The king of the south will be provoked with an exceedingly great and powerful army. He will not withstand. It will divide. It's like 40 verses long. Okay, so there are some good websites. This works. Oh, it didn't work. Why isn't it? Why don't I have it?
You might have to change them. Yeah.
I'm not a fan of technology. Okay. Good. There you go. So, there are lots of websites that do this. They compare actual historical events to prophecies in Daniel 11. Right. So, there are lots of things like this. So, some of the last events when the prophecies were like 175 BCE, right? 167 BCE. These are some of the last events. So for these secular historians that have proposed that this was written after the fact, then we would have to assume that Daniel 11 at least was written at least after 167 BCE, right? That's logical. Because the final events predicted, which are very specific, were written before that. So, go to the slide, right? So, I mean, for a long time, secular historians have assumed it was written after the fact, right? Because Daniel 11 is so detailed, most interpreters consider the chapter a prime example of some Latin phrase, history written as a prophecy, right? That's what people assume it is. Now, in the around 1950, in the Qumran Caves, which is right next to the Dead Sea, we found the Dead Sea Scrolls. Remarkable find. Basically the entire Tanakh, with an exception of the book of Ruth, I believe, in the Qumran Caves. And these Dead Sea Scrolls are amazing, in that we've considered them to the current Masoretic text, which is kind of the mainstream Jewish text, and it's identical. 99% identical. There are a few letter variations and maybe a few word variations which largely don't impact the story at all, like the, he, whatever. But for the most part, it's identical. Now, what the best part about these Dead Sea Scrolls is it gives us back our reliability on the Tanakh by like 1,200 years. Because at the moment, the oldest copies we had of the Tanakh copies were kind of around 1,000 CE, but these have been dated to 200 BCE. So these push back our understanding of reliability of the Torah by 1,200 years. So one of the parchments, 4Q114, is where Daniel 11 is written, because it contains parts of Daniel 11, the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the reason that you probably haven't heard this amazing information before is because the most recent study, which is in my opinion the most remarkable, was June 2025. So that's why I probably haven't heard this information. So here's one of the studies. Reputable institution, peer reviewed, at least fancy academics. Okay, so I don't know if you guys know, radiocarbon dating is the most common form of dating. It's looking at carbon isotope, you don't even know. But there's paleography studies. Radiocarbon's more scientific, right? It's kind of the standard way we date things. Now, 4Q114, this is the Daniel 11 area. If you look here, the blue, which is the radiocarbon range. This is the range. So scientists obviously can't have an exact date of estimation, but they have a range, right? So if you look, it looks like about 230 BCE to 160 BCE. That's the range. That's the range of Daniel 11 estimated. And the mean of that would be like 195 BCE, right? So we know that at very, very minimum, very, very minimum, Daniel 11 was written 160. Absolute minimum, right? And some of the prophecies, the last prophecy that he got right historically, we got them all right, but the latest one was 167, so 7 years. They got, okay, the events happened 7 years after someone wrote it, and they found it in the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? You could argue that. Now, there are a few problems with that. Firstly, it's very much consensus that the areas of Daniel found in the Dead Sea Scrolls were copies. Now, this is a quote I pulled up. According to current historical critical opinion, the Book of Daniel originates in its present form in the Antiochus crisis this is kind of the time period of the last events predicted. It seems very difficult to perceive that one single desert community should have preserved such a significant number of Daniel manuscripts if this book had already been produced at so late a date. Right, so late a date refers to the current secular historical consensus, which is like 160. So, the large number of manuscripts, so there are many copies of Daniel within the Dead Sea Scrolls, many copies of them. The large number of manuscripts, the manuscript is just kind of like a book, just like pages. In this community can be much more better explained if one accepts an earlier origin of Daniel than the one proposed by the Maccabean hypothesis, being that it was 160, of this historical critical scholarship. This is basically saying that because we have copies, you have to assume that this was written, at least in a canon, for the Jewish kind of consensus, well before the day we have it. Yeah.
Why? Explain that again.
This is saying that because in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have lots of copies of Daniel. Like we have like 8 copies of the Book of Daniel, and then someone was taking their own personal notes of it, right?
That was found with the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yes.
Okay.
Which means we can assume
But that was something that came before.
that the Dead Sea Scrolls weren't the original copy of Daniel. And it probably takes like 100 years to circulate. Like if today I said, okay, I'm going to say that 500 years ago, this kind of prophet predicted all these things, and I'm going to insert it into the Jewish canon in the Tanakh. How would I go about doing that? Right? We have all of us have copies of the Tanakh. How would I just put it in and trick everyone into thinking that this existed 100 years before? How would I do that? So we can assume that this was at least maybe a few decades, 100 years before the current Daniel we have. This was we didn't happen by coincidence to have found the original first copy of Daniel 11, which means we can push it way back compared to the current historical dating of the Dead Sea Scrolls. We can push it way back. So it's probably well before 230. The current Jewish view is around 550, right? That's the current Jewish view. So if we push it well before 230, that means it couldn't have been written after the fact. Couldn't have been written after the events happened. So we have dated these scrolls well before these predictions that could only have been made legitimately and not by guesswork. So we actually have the evidence to say that these prophets predicted these things correctly, and they were extremely precise and probably made hundreds of years before the historical events. Like, that should just blow your mind, right? Like, that's amazing. And this is only June this year. June this year, the research came out. I don't know how secular historians can argue with that, right? Like, they would probably, if you ask them, they would probably still say, oh, yeah, it's guesswork. Guesswork. It's not guesswork. You read Daniel 11 for yourself, it's clearly not guesswork. It's so specific. So specific. For a long time, all historians have said Daniel must have been written after the fact because it's so specific. So my point is that if you look at this evidence without having gone through the philosophical arguments prior, you wouldn't have believed the evidence because extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, right? You wouldn't have believed it. So, like, I have a friend, for example, who's an atheist, and he says, in my opinion, there's a 99% chance that there's no God. So I couldn't show you anything. I could show you this, and it wouldn't change his mind because it's more likely, given his conditioned probability, that some absurd claim is right, in that aliens came down and gave it to us. We can go through why aliens make no sense mathematically at another time. Or I don't know, this guy was just like had an IQ of 400 and he just made these predictions. And what an explanation, as absurd as it is more likely than the God did it, because there's a 99% chance there's no God. So that's why you have to go through the philosophical arguments first. Then you have to believe it again. If you saw a symmetrical hole on Mars, even though we still assume there are no humans on Mars, so we would assume it was some natural event. But if you saw it in a backyard where we assume humans exist in the first place, we would assume that a human dug that symmetrical hole in the backyard. So that should be enough. If it's not, we should also want God to exist, because if there's no God, there's no morality, right? Nothing means anything. If someone can explain to me why murder is wrong without God, I'm open ears, because murder is a preference. If there's no God, say, I don't like murder, therefore it's wrong. Why didn't I murder? I didn't murder because I would feel guilty, because I'm evolved to feel guilty if I murder, and I would fear the consequences of having been murdered. And that's enough for me. That's sufficient for me to not murder. But that's not real morality. You cannot say that murder is objectively wrong if you don't believe in God. Because like God creates the laws of logic and God creates the laws of mathematics, God creates the laws of morality. So if it isn't, it's just if you say murder's good and I say murder's bad, who's right? Right? We can't say who's right. Why is murder wrong? Because it creates suffering. Why is suffering wrong? Oh, because I don't like it. You don't like it, therefore it's true. No, that's a preference. The preference is, I prefer chocolate over vanilla. That's a preference. An opinion is, I believe that God exists. That's an opinion. Right? A preference you cannot prove, because a preference is, I like something. So if you don't believe in God, murder is being against murder is a preference. So you should want to believe in God. So I've given you evidence to why God might exist. I've given you evidence to, if God existed, this evidence would be likely to come up, which it did, Dead Sea. And I've given you reasons to want to believe in God in the first place. Hopefully you're inclined to look further into this evidence. Okay, thank you.